In real life, I suffer from congenital condition of cysts that grow anywhere within my central nervous system at the nerve roots. I also have cerebellar atrophy and am bedridden most of the day. I recently have had surgery to repair 3 CSF leaks along my spine about 2.5 weeks ago. CSF is cerebral spinal fluid. I also have Chiari malformation and Tarlov cysts in my sacrum, quite large. Posted. Oh, in Second Life, I am free to be the inner me, enjoying the sounds of music and dancing or meditating to them. I try to help others the best I can. In Second Life, I feel like there is a purpose in my life again, and I have a close knit of friends now that understand me. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Mohammed Al-Mosaiwi. He comes to us from the University of Reading in the UK. Mr. Al-Mosaiwi is a qualified pharmacist and originally had plans to do a PhD in medicinal chemistry. However, he became more and more interested in psychology, so he undertook a master's in cognitive neuroscience at the University of York, and then a PhD in psychology at the University of Reading. His research is focused on the maladaptive impact of absolutist thinking, especially with respect to psychological well-being, and more specifically, anxiety, depression, suicide, and suicidal ideation. His studies attempt to identify the mechanisms by which absolutist thoughts produce detrimental consequences. He also has empirically examined and compared various ways of measuring absolutist thinking. The topic of this presentation is people with depression use language differently. He will present findings from a paper recently published in Clinical Psychological Science. This research found that absolutist words were better markers of depression than negative emotion words. Let's all give Mr. Al-Mosaiwi a warm welcome. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for that, Tata. Hope people can hear me. And trying to make sure that the slide actually moves across. Sorry, bear with me a second. I'm not seeing my own slides. Sure if that's...
I see your first slide.
Brilliant. If I press enter now, could be because before it used to come up in the chat, the lines of...
On the blue teleprompter box?
Here we go. Yes, now I brought it up. That's fine. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for everyone for coming. I'm going to tell you about specific language styles that relate to depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. I'll just go over a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. Here we go, yep. So, what are the linguistic markers of depression? The first thing to explain is that language can be split into the content and the style. So we're going to talk about what the content of language is, what the style is very briefly, and then how the content of language varies with depression and how the style of language varies in depression. and what you can take away from each one of those, because the differences in style should be interpreted differently from the differences. But this will all be clear as we go on. I'm going to present previous findings from my lab and from other labs. I'm going to talk about absolutist words as they relate to absolutist thinking and how absolutist thinking is viewed in mental health. And finally, we're just going to end by talking about some of the applications of analysis, as well as some of the dangers, especially when you combine it with machine learning, where you can begin to classify people as either depressed, anxious, whatever it is, specifically just through computer algorithms. There are applications to that. It could be useful, but there are also dangers, and we'll cover right at the end what those are. So the first thing to cover is the content, and what I mean when I say the content of language. There are two distinct language, style. Content relates to what you want. Subject matter, what you're saying. It's probably best to go through an example. So the kind of content words we mean are things like nouns. So dog is a verbs and adjectives. Beautiful is the content of what you're describing is beautiful. It's it's the subject matter of what you're talking about. So when you look at nouns, verbs, and adjectives, you're looking at content words, and there are thousands of content words, all the different nouns are. To give you an example of what I mean by content, if you consider the phrase that a lot of depressed people might utter, I always feel lonely. The content in that sentence is lonely. That's the word because even if you got rid of all the other words, even if you got rid of I always feel, and you just had the word lonely, you would still know what the subject matter. The word lonely that carries subject matter. But this is what we mean by it conveys the content of a sentence. And if we look at style, there are again two distinct. The style of language relates to how we communicate. So it's not what we're saying; it's the way we're saying it. So the first component of language is content. The second component is style, and style relates to the way in which. It's characterized by words like articles. So articles are like at, the. Prepositions such as on, behind, in, those are prepositions. And conjunctions like but, however, those kinds of words. So these words don't in themselves convey content. They don't tell you what you're talking about. They just tell you about the way you're saying it. So if I go back to my example from before, I always feel lonely. Exactly. The content word here is the word always. So before we had the word lonely was the content word. Sorry, the style word. So the content word was the word lonely. Now we're looking at the style word is the word always. To get rid of all the other words, if I just said to you something, always, something, you'd have no idea what I was talking about. The content isn't there. You don't. There'd be no way to know. So that's the difference between content and hopefully it'll become clearer as we. But functional words or style words, they're also referred to as function words. They tell you how the person is speaking rather than what they are. With regards to the language of depression, the content in the language of depressed people is extremely negative. So again, referring to the content words, it's not a surprise to find out that those with depression, and actually those with anxiety and suicidal ideation, negative word, lonely, negative words. They use them far more than non-depressed people. And this is the reason this is not a surprise to anybody is because we're attuned to notice content words. We're attuned to content of what we say. So when I say I always feel lonely, the word that sticks in your mind is the word lonely, and you think oh, he's talking about loneliness. The I always feel you don't pay as much attention to. You're mainly focusing on the word lonely when you hear some. So it's not a surprise. We already know that people use a lot of negative words. This is not revolutionary stuff. We move on to the next one. Okay, so language of now, if we look at the style, here we might find slightly more interesting things. Those with symptoms of depression have been repeatedly shown to use significantly more first-person singular pronouns. So first-person singular pronouns are I, myself, and me. The words that refer to yourself. So, or me, myself, and I. So people with depression. And in fact, as I was walking in, I think some poem by Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath was depressed. In fact, she committed suicide in the end. And some of this research was actually done on the poetry of Sylvia Plath, as well as the song lyrics of Kurt Cobain and some of the internet forums for depression, anxiety, as well as just diary entries. So we've collected data from a wide variety of sources, from poetry like that of Sylvia Plath, just internet forum text, and we can see across the board that those with depression, anxiety, first persons, first-person singular pronouns, they also use fewer third-person pronouns. Third-person pronouns are pronouns that refer to other people. So she, them, his, her, things like that. So what you essentially have they're using more words that refer to themselves, fewer words that refer to other people. This is entirely consistent with some characteristics that we know about depressed people, which is rumination, and that is to think repeatedly about personal problems. They get stuck thinking, very difficult to think. That's consistent. And there's also social isolation. For a variety of reasons, people with depression suffer from social isolation. And that, again, may explain why they're using fewer third-person pronouns. They're referring to other people less. Continue to move along this. We found that actually these personal pronouns were better markers for depression than negative emotion. Quite hard to believe that would be the case. Like I said, when you say, I always feel lonely. Yeah, so in that statement, I always feel lonely, you can see that there is a personal pronoun there. The word I is there. But it's not what you would know, it's not what you would most pay attention to. You would most pay attention to is the word lonely. But actually, the word I and personal pronouns like the word I are better at identifying those with depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation than a word like lonely, than the negative emotion words. All counterintuitive there. So if I present some of the data, so this is data from other people's labs. If I just pretend some of the data from my own lab, we conducted a very large-scale text analysis study that examined text posts from over 6,400 of 63 different internet forums. We were looking to investigate the use of absolutist words for those weird. We developed and independently validated an absolutist words dictionary. And this is a dictionary that, for example, I think the dictionary had in the end 19 words in it. And they were all absolutist words. Words like always, never, completely, everything, everyone, every, all. They're all absolutist. Absolutist words are words that characterize a situation as all or nothing, and there's no nuance in them. So black and white, all or nothing state of totality, without any nuance in what absolutist words are. And so the words that I just rattled off, like always, never, completely, these are absolutist words, and they are functional words. Because if I say something, always, something, something, you don't know what the content of that sentence is. You just know that's got the word always in it, but you don't know always what. Always happy, always sad, always smiling. All the content is missing. You've only got the functional word always. So again, in the original example that I gave, I always feel lonely. You have the negative emotion word lonely, personal pronoun I, and you also have the word always. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at those absolute words. So if I move to the next slide. Okay. So this is, I hope people can see the slide. I think you may, there were, as I said, a number of test forums and control forums. So these are just internet forums, online internet forums. You could probably go on them now or go to your Russian forum in Google. There are places where people just write about how they feel, depression, and there are even suicidal ideation forums. Although I think a lot of the suicide, they're not very healthy places for people. And we did a text analysis, an automated text analysis of all of this data. So basically the computer reads what everyone's been writing and calculates the percentage prevalence of absolutist words as we define them in our dictionary. So who is using more absolutist words than whom? And we found that people in the anxiety and depression forums were using words at 1.4%, whereas people in the control forum were using words at a rate of 1%. So there's a 40% increase in absolutist words between those who are in the control forum. So that is, they don't have depression. These are things like Mumsnet and Student Room and places like that. They use it at 1%, and 1% is about the general average. In all of us, in our natural language, 1% is the words we all use. But those with anxiety and depression, absolutist words at 1.4%, so they're 40% greater. And those with suicidal ideation use absolutist words at 1.8%. So they're another 40% greater. They're 80% greater than controls, 40% greater than anxiety and depression. And so you can see it's actually quite a pattern there. As the severity of the illness increases, so from depression, anxiety to suicidal ideation, you may assume that's a more severe condition, depression. You have a corresponding increase, so it goes up with the severity of the condition. I'll just get through this bit. Those are the control forums. Next slide, I think. If I just present some other data we got using the same, some other of the results using the same data. So we're now looking at, I hope you can see the graphs, we're looking at negative emotion words and pronouns and the pattern of negative emotion words and pronouns across control, anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation forum. So if we look at negative emotion words first, see that in anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation, people use negative emotion at about 4%, increasing to 5% in anxiety. Whereas in control groups, they used it at about 2%. So those with depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation are using twice as many negative emotion words as those in the control group. But you may notice something interesting there, which is that those with anxiety use negative emotion words more than those with depression, and those with depression use negative emotion words more than with suicidal ideation. Not much more, but more. That intuitively doesn't make sense. If you assume that negative emotion, that suicidal ideation is a more severe condition, is worse than depression, then you would assume that negative emotion words would be higher than in depression. But we don't find that. We actually find that those with suicidal fewer negative emotions than those with anxiety and depression. And therein lies the problem with measuring content words. So negative emotions are content words, they're what you're talking about. It's often not very a reliable measure because it varies so much based on the context of what you're talking about, that you get these sort of weird aberrations where you find suicidal ideation is actually used for negative emotion words and anxiety. If we look at pronouns, which were function words, again, so it's me, myself, and I, that's what I mean by pronouns, it's first person singular pronouns, me, myself, and I. We find that those with anxiety and depression pronouns then in the control group, they use it at a rate of 10%, whereas in the control group it's about 7%, that graph. So there's a 30% increase in frequency of pronouns. And then those with suicidal ideation use pronouns at 12%. So they're 2% higher than those with anxiety and depression. That pattern makes a lot more sense. That's the kind of pattern what we saw with the absolutist words, where you get an increase for anxiety and depression, and then you get another increase in ideation. Matches the severity of those conditions. That makes much more intuitive sense. The effects, the size of the differences here is smaller than for absolutist words. So you can see from control to anxiety and depression, we're going up by 20%. Whereas with the absolutist words, we went up by 40%. So absolutist words are finding bigger differences between anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and control groups. And control groups are those without the... They're finding bigger differences there than pronouns. But at least pronouns are finding the right pattern of results, similarly to absolute. And I'm just going through study 2 here. So in study 2, this might be a little bit difficult to get across. Hopefully not. But what we were trying to achieve was, okay, so those with anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation are using more absolutist words. Why? Why are they using more? Is it because they are more prone to absolutist thinking, or do absolutist words just go up when you're upset? So the more upset you are, the more absolutist words you use. Whether or not it doesn't matter whether you have depression or not. It's just if you're more upset, you use more absolutist words. That might be one interpretation. Or it might be that these absolutist words are specifically related to absolutist thinking, which is found in anxiety. So what we did is we studied 4 different conditions: schizophrenia, PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorder, ED, and borderline personality disorder, BPD, and investigated the frequency of absolutist words in each one of those groups. So this is the same as before. These are internet forums for these different conditions. Eating disorder, ED, and borderline personality disorder are known to have a high amount of absolutist. We already know that from previous studies, that these 2 conditions. Therefore, we would expect a high percentage prevalence of absolutist words in those forums. Schizophrenia and PTSD are not known to have high amounts of absolutist thinking, as far as we know. These are not conditions that have been linked to absolutist thinking. So absolutist thinking are people who think in black and white terms, all or nothing. Things will always be this way. I'll never get... They see the world in black and white. And it's not been known to be associated. There is a bit of it there, but they're not strongly associated. So if the increase in absolutist words relates to psychological distress, because these groups, the schizophrenia group, are psychologically distressed. If you have PTSD, you're psychologically distressed, and if you have schizophrenia, you're also psychologically distressed. You're unhappy. If increasing absolutist words is related to that, then we should also see those two groups have a high amount of words in their language. Because we find that they don't, and that only eating disorder and BPD have high absolute, we can conclude absolutists do not relate to psychological distress. They don't relate to how unhappy. What they relate to is whether or not you're prone to absolutist thinking, and that's what this graph shows. And just to cement that point, if you look at graph B, which I have behind me, in graph B, the negative emotions is showing that PTSD has a really high amount of negative emotion words in that group. It's up at 4%, which is higher than it is for eating disorder and borderline personality disorder. So those in the post-traumatic stress disorder group are more negative than those in the eating disorder group and the borderline personality disorder. However, they use fewer absolutist words. So the point that I'm trying to get across here is that it's not related to how unhappy you are. Even those who are quite unhappy, like those in post-traumatic stress disorder, they use a high amount of negative, but they don't use a high. So absolutist words are not you're unhappy. They're tracking something else. They're tracking your tendency towards having all or nothing, black and white thinking. That's what this study was about, and that's what it shows there. And so, I may have gone too far, but I can explain what was on the previous clip. We also, in the depression forums, there are some forums for recovery. These are people who were depressed, but they now feel like they have recovered from depression. So they write on the recovery forum, special places online where people go and they write positive about their recovery. So that I used to be depressed, I'm now feeling better. They just write good stuff that's happening, encouraging stuff. Very, very positive posts. What was interesting is that we still found a high amount of absolutist words in the recovery group. So even those who have recovered from depression, who are not currently suffering from depression, they still produced a high amount of absolutist. This is quite significant, because what it suggests is that absolutist words use and absolutist thinking, so thinking in black and white, might be what's known as a cognitive vulnerability factor for depression. It might be making them more vulnerable to becoming depressed in the future, because they're using a high amount of absolutist words more than people who aren't depressed, even though at that time they're also not depressed. So it almost doesn't matter whether they're depressed or not. When they were depressed, they were using a high amount of absolutist words. When they're not depressed, when they've recovered from depression, because depression is sort of cyclical. You get depressed for an episode, then you feel better for a while, then sometimes lapse back. So in the gap between those two depression, people are still using a high amount of absolutist words. It's almost like a habit that they got into, and we believe that it might actually be making them more vulnerable to falling back into depression in the. So that's what that study shows. Even when they've recovered from depression, they're still using a high amount of absolutist words. I think on the graph it says 1.3%, and if you remember previously it was 1.4%. So they're very, very close to anxiety and depression. So I think the next slide is absolutism and mental health. I hope that's what's showing behind me. The idea that those with depression and those with mental health problems more generally have what's known as an absolutist thinking style, which is that they view the world in black and white, all or nothing. That's well known. That's been well known since the 1960s. Sometimes I don't think people pay enough attention. negative bias, not enough on the absolutist thinking style that people have. But it's been well known that those with mental health issues have an absolutist thinking style. They view the world in black and white. It's a recognized cognitive distortion in most cognitive therapies. A lot of therapists are trying to challenge that, and it's actually being challenged quite a lot in what's called the third wave therapies. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the third wave therapies. So these are things like mindfulness. But mindfulness is private simply, but it's a way of just noticing your thoughts and not being judgmental about them. But one thing they stress a lot in mindfulness is that you should be flexible in your thinking, not too attached to any particular thought. So it dives very well non-absolutist. That is sort of what I'm advocating. Forms of therapy, which is non-absolutist about the world, and that's very much carried through with the recent. I mean, mindfulness isn't new; it's actually very old, but it's new to the West relative to cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been around since the late 1960s. John Teasdale introduced mindfulness into the psychotherapeutic realm. I think that was sort of in the 80s, so it's a little bit. It came a little bit later, but again, mindfulness is not new. It's been around for a very, very long time, but yeah, it's new to us. So anyway, that's moving on from that. I'll just cover what might be. Sorry, bear with me a second. Okay, hopefully that's shown up the next slide there. The applications of machine learning. So in conducting this study, there were some key ethical concerns in that we were essentially, I wrote a program that there was a computer program that read the posts. These were public posts. These were posts that people put up on the internet publicly, so find any password or anything. And it read thousands and thousands of them. Like I think we had 6,400 members, all of their posts on 60 forums. This is not something that I would have been able to do myself. It would have taken me a very long time to read all of that, but a computer can do it very quickly. So the computer read all of these posts and then started categorizing the words that people used into absolutist or non-absolutist, and then calculated the prevalence of the absolutist. Now, I was interested in words. You could do it with other things. You could do it with negative emotion words, pronouns, family words, words about cats, whatever you feel like doing it about. And then based on that, on those numbers that are produced, put that data in learning algorithm or machine, artificial intelligence is a little bit too high tech for what we actually did. But it's basically just a statistical classifier that will look at those numbers and say, based on those numbers, I, the computer, think that this person is depressed. Or I, the computer, think that this person has anxiety based on the percentage prevalence of their negative emotion words, their whatever other words that you want to give it. Sometimes it's not even counting words. Sometimes it's just for example, one thing is lexical diversity, which is how many different kinds of words a person is using. So the more different, give you an example of this being used in application, there's research to suggest that those with early onset dementia use fewer different kinds of words. So their sentences are a lot more simple than those who don't have that's one way to diagnosis of those with those with early onset dementia. In fact, Ronald Reagan was diagnosed. Ronald Reagan, the president, ended up with early onset dementia, and some scientists looked at his speeches, I think State of the Union addresses and some other speeches that he made, and found that the concept of lexical diversity, which is the number of different kinds of words he uses was much lower than other presidents like George Bush, not George W. Bush, George Herbert Bush, father. And based on that, they thought that this is a key marker, so a key way to identify those who may have early onset dementia. So you can do it with early onset dementia. Also find other markers for depression, markers for anxiety, some markers for anxiety, and then you can use automated text analysis that's done by the computer with machine learning to then so humans are not involved in any of this. The computer can then identify, look, I think this person has an X probability of being, I think this other person has, another probability of being suicidal, or PTSD, or BP, borderline personality disorder, or a whole variety of conditions. That can be useful. There are possible uses for that, but there are obviously some key dangers. So if I just go through quickly the uses of that, you can identify vulnerable people. That's the good thing. If you can, humans don't have time to go through all this text, but if a computer say, look, I think this person is vulnerable and help, that's a good thing. It can help with diagnosis. In fact, it's been shown that this method, the text analysis method and the machine learning, is better at diagnosing people than psychiatrists. It's been shown multiple times. It's actually quite hard to believe that's true, but if I can send anybody who's interested in the studies where the computer is actually diagnosing depression and other conditions better than psychiatrists, better than human psychiatrists. Somewhat remarkable. It can provide psychological insights, like the absolutist words one that I just presented. So it shows how important absolutist thinking is to depression. It can give you self-knowledge. Maybe people didn't realize that somebody might have depression, and they can go through this program, and the program could tell them, look, you're using a really high amount of personal pronouns, first person singular pronouns. And that person may not have been aware themselves that they were doing that. They were not aware that a lot of the stuff that they're saying is about them, and they're focusing maybe too much on themselves, and that maybe it's healthier to not do that. This is a self-insight that possible advantage this method. And the last one that I've put there is signposting. Signposting. So it can direct people to the right kind of treatment they need. So I, for example, wrote a program that can categorize people as having anger, whether they have anger problems or not. A lot of people who have anger management problems don't know that they have anger management problems. And so they can write some natural language about the stuff that's bothering them. And then the computer will tell them, look, I think you could benefit from some anger management therapy or some anger management classes. That might be interesting to them to know that. So it can help signpost best kind of help available to them. The way this would work, and I hope that you're seeing. Yeah, so I hope you're seeing the cycle behind me with the woman standing in the middle. But essentially, just the mechanism of how this works is that a person produces data in the form of natural language. So that's just them writing stuff. I feel sad today because it's raining and blah, 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 whatever they're saying. That then undergoes automated text analysis. The text analysis gets fed into a machine learning algorithm. The machine learning algorithm labels that text as, for example, perfectionistic, so that perfect standards for things, and they get very upset if things aren't perfect. It could label them as having problems, social phobia, self-esteem. Name it, it's a whole range of things. So it's not just depression, be a lot more specific. And then that can then trigger the relevant intervention. So if you identify that somebody has self-esteem issues, you can then target that person with interventions that are designed to help increase their self-esteem. So this is a way that it could potentially be of benefit to them, because then they can get the right kind of intervention that would be most helpful to them. But I'll just end by talking about the dangers, because there are dangers. And those are basically that it can be monetized. Whenever you do anything that's remotely helpful or useful, there's always somebody trying to find a way of making money out of it. And the financial incentive comes into this, and this whole thing becomes monetized. Not entirely sure that that's going to be a good thing. Avoid that happening, people making money out of it. I think probably the most concerning aspect would be that it would be used to discriminate. If employers, for example, could do a text analysis Facebook post and finds, the algorithm, the computer is telling me that this person has anxiety problems, so maybe I'm not going to hire them because I don't want to hire somebody who has anxiety. This is clearly a very bad use of the technology. This is not what we want people to do. We don't want people to use this to discriminate against people. I mean, I'm using the example of an employer, but it can be anything really. So there's a really, really big problem there, using this data to discriminate against those with not just mental health problems, but in this case it would be a variety of mental health problems. So that would be a very concerning thing. There's obviously violations of privacy. I'm in the UK, and we have here the company Cambridge Analytica. It's been in the news a little bit, but they are in trouble along with Facebook for violating people's privacy, and a lot of people will deem it a violation of their posts, labeling that those labels become and it makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. Concerns regarding privacy there. And the final point that I'll make is that it shouldn't be used to replace person-to-person therapy. So even though I said computers have been shown to be better at diagnosing people than psychiatrists, that doesn't mean they're better at providing the therapy than psychiatrists. As a human being, as people with depression, they want to talk to other human beings. They don't want to talk to a computer. So you still want to have human beings providing therapy to other human beings. You don't want this being done by a computer. But the computer shouldn't replace the therapist. It should just help the therapist as a tool. And I'm especially in some places where governments find that they are lacking resources, there might be too much of a temptation. Well, let's get rid of therapists who are expensive, and we'll just have this computer provide therapy to people. You know, the computer can diagnose people, and then it can, based on that diagnosis, it can then direct them to online intervention that they can do. That might be useful. It might be useful, but it's important that that doesn't replace human therapy. There's a sort of cautionary tale there. And I think we can take questions at this point. I'm not sure if... I think that might be the end of the slide. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Feel free to email me. Write my email.
Mohammed, thank you very much. That was quite an informative presentation. Mook has a question for you, and it's a very long one.
Okay.
She asks, have you found that the awareness changes the reaction issue here might skew absolutist words as a diagnostic tool? That if the participants find out that they are producing absolutist words as a result of depression or mental issues, would that self-knowledge modify their future choice of words when speaking to others, whether consciously or not? Could they still have depression, etc., but without their words reflecting that, and consequently making this difficult as a diagnostic tool? Did you catch all of that?
Yep, I did, and it's a great question. And it helps me to point out a couple of things. So you're right. If you notice that you're using absolutist you might think to yourself, oh, I can stop doing that. Instead of saying, I always feel lonely, you can say, I feel lonely a lot of the time. So you've basically got rid of the absolutist words, and now you're saying it in a non-absolutist way, because the word a lot of the time. So you can do that. In a way, that's what we want people to. I don't want people using. I want them to change. Because if you change the way you speak, the belief is the way you speak reflects the way you think. So and that's kind of what was the point of study 2. A high amount of absolute words means that you think in an absolutist way. So if you change that, if you start using fewer absolutist words in your language, that may be a very powerful form of therapy, in that it might reduce your thinking style, of your absolutist thinking style. So you might think in a less absolutist way. So there is certainly that possibility. It's not that easy to change your style of speaking, though, because absolutist words, as I mentioned, are functional words, and we don't pay that much attention to functional words. Normally talk, you're focusing on what you're trying to say, not how you say it. So a lot of people don't really know that they're using a lot of absolute. Those who do use lots of absolute words are not aware of it. When you point it out to them, when I've pointed it out to them, they're often very surprised that, oh, I didn't realize I was doing this, and they see their text, they're like, oh, okay, I can see words I'm using, but they had no idea that they were doing it before. So obviously, if somebody is aware of that, they can hide it. But I would just say that it's actually quite difficult to hide you can hide it for a little while, but to just constantly be aware of the the functional words you're using is quite difficult long term, because there are what we call an implicit measure rather than an explicit measure. They're not the thing you're paying most attention to, is the content of what you're saying, not the way you say it. But just to go back to Mook's point, if people do try to hide it by forcing themselves not to use absolutist words, I think that's a good thing. I think that's a way to try to get them to change the way they think. So they use few absolutist words means that maybe they think less in an absolutist way. I hope that's addressed the question.
Thank you. And Mook says that makes very good sense. We have another question from Willow Riddler. Willow says, how accurate were those graphs, considering the percentages were at two different starting points in comparison of the said A and B graphs from earlier? Willow has concerns, and more so, why were the number percentages different from each other when they were supposed to compare statistics?
When you say A and B, I'm not entirely sure which graph you mean. Is that in study 2? So study 2 had A and B graphs for absolutist words and negative emotion words. The absolute rates for different word categories is different. So, for example, the normal amount of absolutist words used is about 1%, whereas the normal amount of negative emotion words used is about 2%. So there are more negative emotion used. It's not that difference that's interesting. The difference within groups. So it's how much greater is anxiety and depression relative to control for negative emotion words and for absolutist words. If you're looking at between graphs, if you're looking at graph A, which is showing absolutist words, and graph B, which is showing negative emotion words, those are very difficult to compare because the absolute rates are different. And so I wouldn't compare across graphs. I would only look at within graphs, because you're looking at the control group in that graph and how much greater the anxiety and depression group is compared to the control group within that class. All the studies have A and B. Yeah, so study 2 had A and B. Study 1 had negative, yeah, well, I mean, I guess you can call it an A and B only. Had negative emotion words and again, so we use a lot more pronouns in our language than we use negative emotion words. Even those with depression use more pronouns than it. So about 8 to 10% pronouns, whereas negative emotion words is about 4 to 5%. That's just a feature of the language. But when you're looking at Okay, so the differences within groups were. Oh, okay. So that's somebody's writing whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, that,
So I wouldn't compare across classes of words. I wouldn't compare negative emotion words with pronouns and pronouns with absolutist words, because they just have different absolute rates within themselves. But across the groups, so control, anxiety, depression, and ideation, you can see that for pronouns, for example, it goes up, and then for negative emotion words, it goes up from control, and same for absolute. So it's Mo, in your second study, when you analyzed the language used in forums, absolutely, yeah. So I can share the paper that I wrote. A paper. It's published in Clinical. I can make that available. I think it is in the end of my slides. There's a link to it. I'm not sure because I can't see what's behind me, but if it's not, I can email it to whoever wants it. And in that paper, there's a supplementary material section with all of the websites that we used, with dictionary that we used, with basically everything you want is available. When I publish work, I try to make sure that all the data we used is publicly available so that you can actually go back and do the whole thing yourself.
and Mohammed, if you would email me that paper,
Yep. Sure.
and if Moonlight wants to IM me an email, I'll send that on. Whoever wants to have that paper, if they want to IM me, just give me their email and IM. I can do that.
Sure. And there's a literature review at the beginning of that paper where I cite other academics, like James Pennebaker is quite famous in this, and there are references to his study. So anybody who wants to follow up further can follow those references to work as well.
That's useful. And we have a follow-up from Willow. Willow understands where you were coming from in regards to the context of depression, BPD, etc. It was just the starting point of graph A was at 1%, and the graph B was starting at 1.5%, giving it a boost, so to speak, therefore giving the inaccuracy.
Yep, you're right. So the difference here is, okay. So again, you're comparing absolutist words. So graph A was showing absolutist words, and it did start at 1%. And graph B was showing negative emotion words, and this start at 1.5%. I mean, the differences there was mainly just so I can as a way to display it in the most clear way possible. But if you were to look at graph B, and I can make these slides available to people examine this further, if you look at graph B, see that PTSD is higher. That bar is higher than ED and B, eating disorder and borderline personality disorder. So that is the relative difference in negative emotions between PTSD, ED, and BPD, irrespective of what the y-axis is showing. And so the point that I'm making here is, even though PTSD is using more negative emotion words than eating disorder and borderline personality disorder, if you look at graph A, it's using fewer absolutist words than eating disorder and borderline personality disorder. You can almost ignore what the y-axis is, because it's the differences between the groups within that graph that matter, rather than comparing across the graphs. So the reason the y-axis for A and B is different is because the absolute rates for negative emotion words and absolutist words is different. That's actually the case for all the graphs that I show. Almost none of my graphs start at 0, because sorry, is somebody?
Live stream.
Oh, I thought someone was asking a question. Never mind. So yeah, it's very rare that I start my y-axis at 0, because sometimes it doesn't display the chart as clearly as possible. But again, I just reiterate, it's the differences within the graph that I'm trying to get across, rather than comparing across graphs. Oh, is it possible to show slide 7 again? Is that possible?
It's showing.
Oh, is it showing behind me?
Yes,
Okay.
I moved it.
Oh, thanks very much. So I assume graph 7 is the one with study 2 on it.
Study 1, actually.
Oh, study 1, and is it showing negative emotion, words, and pronouns?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So yes, again, in that one, they both do start at 0. So in that axis, they both start as and what that's showing is that the key thing here is that the anxiety and depression use slightly more negative emotion words suicidal ideation. And the point that I'm trying to make there, that content words are not very reliable in terms of tracking the severity of it. You would expect more negative emotions.
And Zombie came in late, and she is asking, what do you define as negative emotion words?
So the negative emotion words are not defined by me, they're defined by James Pennebaker, who I mentioned earlier. He came up, he essentially it was almost democratically decided, because they came up with a list of words that they believed were negative, so words like sad, miserable, unhappy, lonely, words like that. And then those words were judged by a group of independent judges. And they basically said, okay, I think this one's negative, I don't think this one's negative. And so it sort of democratically decided in his lab which words were going to be designated as negative and which words were not negative. And that's again, I can make the link to that available. The program is called the Linguistic Inquiry Word Counts. And the negative emotion words are defined in that software. There's a whole list of them. I can't remember how many there are, but I think they're all just negative emotion words. So angry, sad, miserable, words like that.
Okay, and while our transcribers are catching up with that, we have another question from Big Guy. He is asking, how does low self-esteem, high self-awareness associated with MDD and related disorders manifest as more definitive language as opposed to less, as you'd expect from a person who'd be in a constant state of self-doubt?
That's interesting. So the idea here there is, if you have low self-esteem, you have self-doubt, as Big Guy points out, and so it does seem surprising that they would be so definitive in their language. But I would question what you mean by self-doubt. Why is it that they doubt themselves? If you speak to these people and examine them a little further, find that their self-doubt is usually because they'll have some narrative like this. They'll say something like, people must like me, or I have to have people always like me, something like that. And so there's an absolutist word there, and because they believe that people must like them, they have to have people like them, that fills them with doubt when they go around, because they think, oh, does this person, or that this person, because they're so desperate to have like them. I mean, this is just an example. It could be something else. But they're so desperate to have like them, they're constantly doubting whether or not somebody. So it's actually an absolute creating the doubt that you say. So you just dig a little deeper, find that at the root of it, there is an absolute that's causing what on the surface might seem very non-absolute reaction, which is doubt. To doubt is essentially very, very non-absolute. Essence doubting, but if there's a healthy kind of doubting, but the unhealthy kind of doubting where you're just constantly worrying about, am I making the right decision? Am I doing this? Am I doing that? That's often being driven by some sort of absolutism, where you say to yourself, I have to have people like me, or I have to get this job, or I cannot lose this girlfriend, or whatever it is. Then that your relationships and your that brings in the doubt into your life there. I hope that I've understood that question and addressed it. I'm not sure if that the guy was after there.
There was a lot in that question, wasn't there? So we now have a question from Sister. She says, language and language usage is learned. Do you consider that negative emotion words might be more frequently used in a language group, like a forum, where others are using negative emotion words? That is, people tend to mirror the language in which they are immersed.
Yeah. So, I guess the social media term for that is echo chamber, where you have an echo chamber where people just repeat stuff that they hear from others, and they might actually just somebody else. If somebody else is very negative and they're answering them, they might use that may well be the case in internet. Why we don't just rely on internet forums. We look at a variety of sources. Like I said, the poetry of Sylvia Plath, the lyrics of Kurt Cobain, diary entry, write their own, offer up for internet forums, Facebook. So you look at a diverse source, whole diverse range of data, and you see this pattern across all the data. So that's why you can't stick to one data. But even if the echo chamber effect, so as you say, language is learnt and they're learning from each other, even if that was the case, and I think it is, what that can do is magnify and affect the negative words. It doesn't create it. So that forum has a tendency towards negativity because it's a depression forum. Now that might be magnified because of the learning effect, bigger than it actually is, but it's not created by it, because you then have to ask yourself, why isn't this happening in the control forums? Why aren't they learning negativity from each other there? It's because, well, it just doesn't exist there to begin with, to the same extent as they didn't have it there in the first place. So while I accept the learning language from each other might magnify the effect of negative words for forums, not just negative words use, it could be absolutist words use or pronoun use as well. While it might magnify that effect, it's not going to create it. So there must have been something there for it to be magnified.
And Luke reminds us that technically the first echo chamber that we have in our lives is our immediate family. And Sister says, but if you are measuring frequency of use, amplifying is relevant.
It's only relevant to that if you're only looking at that one forum. So you're right, frequency of words, you do have to take that into account, but if the amplifying almost makes the signal easier to measure, but it doesn't create the signal. So it will increase the frequency of that word use. You're right. The amplifying effect will increase the frequency of negative emotion words use. So you can't say that in real life it'll be 1.4%. But I'm more trying to identify what components of language are being used in one forum, the anxiety, depression, suicidalization forums, as opposed to the control forums. And I'm finding that this feature, negative emotion words, pronouns, and absolutist words, exists here. The absolute rate, which is to say whether it's 1.4%, 1.5%, that might shift up and down based on the echo chamber effect or not. Quite possibly. So I wouldn't say that 1.4% is the rate that's used by depression in every context. Just because we found it for internet forums, that means it's also going to be the case in private domain and in poetry and whatever. I wouldn't say that. I would just say that it's way higher here than it is in the control forum. And the negative bias that we're not being created by might be amplified, but it's not being created by the negative. You're right. You can't say, just because we found that it's 1.4 in depression forums, doesn't mean that that's just the magic number, and we apply that to every other.
I'm going to skip ahead one question, then go back. Emmy asked, have you compared someone's written words to their spoken words?
I have not, but it has been done. I think the person who did it was a guy called Matthias Meal. Again, I think he's cited in my CPS paper. In fact, I'm sure he is, where he attached recording devices to those people who have depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. And the recording device randomly turned on at multiple times during the day. So these people just carried this recording device with them about, I can't remember. And it just kept randomly turning on for 10-second snippets, recording whatever they were saying. Maybe they weren't saying anything, but times when they were saying something. And then that was analyzed, and they found the same results as using text analysis, so written text analysis. Again, the percentage frequencies might be different. So they might have found more personal pronouns or less personal pronouns, I'm not sure, but the pattern was the same. So the fact that they used more personal pronouns was how much more. I can't remember exactly what they found, so that wouldn't have been exactly the same as it was in text. But the fact that they found that pattern was consistent using speed.
Let's go back and pick up the previous question. Moonlight said, is that machine learning can be adjusted to detect other linguistic elements, or is it fixed?
The machine learning, you have to essentially tell it which elements you're interested in beforehand. So it doesn't identify elements itself. It doesn't say, I'm going to decide to measure pronouns now. I guess it can be done in that way. That would require more sophisticated machine learning than I'm capable of programming. I've never done it that way. In fact, I'm sure it can be done that way. It just requires more. In my case, I told it which data should be. So I told it, look, you're going to be interested in pronouns, words, negative emotion words, and whatever else. And then it counted those, counted the percentage prevalence of those words. And then what it does is it has a training set. So if you have your whole data set is 100%, it uses about 70% of that data as a training set. And that training set is labeled. So it knows the answers. It knows that this text sample comes from someone with depression, this text sample comes from someone with anxiety, etc., etc. It then recognizes the patterns for the words that it found and the labels, depression, anxiety. It then uses that in a statistical classifier. In my case, I use what's called a naive Bayes classifier, but it's basically just a statistics. Machine learning is a bit of a fancy way to just say statistics. It uses statistical mathematics to then say, based on this new data that I'm getting in the 30%, I think this person is depressed, given what I've learned from before. So in my case, I told it what to look for. But I think if you are a more capable programmer than me, you could design a machine learning algorithm that actually itself identified which markers are of most interest. So it would then itself decide, actually, I'm not interested in pronouns, I'm interested. But that's beyond my capability.
Okay. I think it's time that we need to, unfortunately, stop the question and answers.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Moonlight asked, is there a link to download your software? And I don't think there is.
There's no link to download it, but I can email it to people. So I can email. I wrote the software in R programming. I don't know if Moonlight's R language. It's a statistics program that academics sometimes. So I can certainly email you that file that I use. The linguistic inquiry word count software. You're welcome. The linguistic inquiry word count software is available to buy. That's not my program. That belongs to James Pennebaker. Sells it to people. So I'm not sure whether people.
And that information is probably in the paper that you're going to email me that I can email out to others, right?
Yeah. In fact, after I've done talking here, I'll email you everything, the paper, the program, all that stuff. So that should all be available.
That would be great. Thank you so much. This was really very interesting. It really reminds us to think about our language. Audience, let's give some good applause to our speaker. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here. There's a little absolutist word for you. Okay, thanks. Bye.